Well, good afternoon, everybody. And just to say that this time last week, I was chomping at the bit to get out of hospital. So I had no voice in the first half of the week. So please forgive me if I cough, but Ed has been very kind and put chunks of my talk up as each slide comes through. So if I have to just go sideways and cough, you will still be able to read things. So there we are. Now, Philip was talking about a place, Weathering Set, which is just about where my little arrow is here. So he's already explained we're in the middle of dairy country, and that's where Debenham is. Debenham was a former market town, and quite clearly it was a prosperous place, and it's the source of the River Deben. One too many. Right. 42 years ago, when I was living in Debenham, I've been there 10 years, we put on an exhibition called Behind the Facade. Its obvious title indicates that behind the polite facades of buildings on the main street, there were timber frame buildings of quite a lot of interest. And this was the building that it was held in, which is the Market Cross, built sometime around about 1625, 1630, with an open ground floor for selling cheeses and an upper hall, which was converted into the village school around about 1660. The town itself has a sort of south-north road straight through it. You can see from the church here, the south is this end going up north, and the marketplace in the middle here is where the buildings were that we were concentrating on. The house I was living in was in Gracechurch Street here, and this street coming in from the west, although it is plateau land in a sense, Debenham is in a valley, hence the fact you've got the river there. And this road coming in from the west is actually arriving on a little hill in the middle of the town here, which is why it's called Cheese Hill in this area. And that's the building, the red one on the corner where this was held. And you can see from the things on the written on the side that there were a lot of drawings. And I owe a great deal of debt to Mike Finch, who is a professional surveyor working in the town. And he surveyed with me and drew the buildings up, some of which you will see today. But it included lots of other material in that exhibition. And yes, so it's Cheese Hill, and I've already explained what you see on the screen. Right, now the manorial holdings in this town were very complicated, and at the time of the exhibition, we didn't fully understand them. But eventually we had the help of Peter Northeast, a tutor working with us, who found that the family at Crow's Hall, about a mile and a half outside the town, had pulled together a survey which was done in 1621. And that survey managed to then make sense because the owner of Crow's Hall, Charles Framlingham, was able to buy up great blocks of land. And so the manors were all put together. And we'll be talking about that in a little while. And I'll explain about these other places that are marked in here. We'll see this map again in a little while. The marketplace itself has at the center of it a guild hall, the Guild of the Holy Trinity, which is the building on the left here. So this is one of Mike's drawings. The one you saw was one of his, and I have to thank Lee Prosser for making new sets of drawings from all the tracings. So that's the last of the yellow ones that you will see. But the guild hall itself was built around about this, described as newly built in 1460, and together with the building next door, which is called the Guiling House, which is the brew house that made the had the vats here to make the drink for the great feast that went on in the upper room when they saw their brethren off. And Mike's wife Sue did all the little drawings which brought these to life, which helped with the exhibition. But what I wanted to say was we took the drawings down to see Eric Mercer, and he encouraged me to join the VAG, and I came to a couple of conferences about this time, and I realized that the VAG was very good at drawing up all these buildings and things, and I was about to have an exhibition of sculptures in America. And so I decided to concentrate on three aspects which I didn't see covered by the VAG. The first was the use of color in buildings, not necessarily wall paintings, of which we've got quite a lot in the town, but the use of plain color that's used on the timber here. And you can see this is from the top of a roof So we get it in the 15th and 16th century. Mostly it's red ochre at that time, though yellow ochre was used, but it's not so common in Debenham. And but by the time you get on into the next century, you begin to see what we've already seen from Andrea's talk, that the timbers themselves were painted with plain colours, and then usually in the upper rooms they would often add columns, capitals and bases to them to give the impression of a classical room. So I'm going to describe this room here in a little while, just to explain that you're looking at two different schemes there. The mullions themselves are painted with white, particularly in the 16th century, as this one is. This is from the Ram on the corner of Grace Street, which you'll see in a minute. One of the corner mullions replaced in the 17th century, but I've got a number of fragments of these which are painted white. And in the 17th century, white is used again, as is grey in our area. And although the internal colours are usually done with a size-based pigment to hold the colours together, hold the pigments together, for reasons that are quite obvious, that you use oil paint on the windows because of the water that's running off the glass and the lead canes. And so you get this sort of impression where you get the mullions painted grey or black, and then the minium colour for the bars in the middle. It's quite often that you find that the lower floors of buildings have metal bars in them, but they skimp and put wooden bars upstairs, but they paint this red lead on. You can't tell the difference from the outside. This particular window comes from a house I live in, and it was panelled here, which is why it's not painted on the outside. But the other thing that I noticed in Debenham when we were putting this exhibition on, and we put parts of the photographs there, was that the brickwork was painted. And I had found no evidence of anybody writing about this. The only person who mentioned it was Saltzman, who was talking about penciling, but he didn't explain what it was. But in a sense, we're going to look at this, this building a little bit later. This is a 1520s building, number 3 in the High Street here. And you can see that the masons who were putting this brickwork together would smear the mortar across, because we weren't able to make the sort of fine bricks you get on the continent. So by doing this and then lining it out and then painting the whole thing with ruddle, which is red ochre with a size-based paint, you unify the whole thing and create the illusion of fine joints. And quite often they paint white lines in here, or very occasionally black, as you can see in this one. So this house has got a number of these fireplaces here, of which I can't detect any penciling except the plainest room upstairs, which is the hall chamber. And there you've got the black penciling. But in the 17th century, it was much more common to find this. This is white penciling. And you find that often the chimney lintel beams are painted in the 17th century with grey, but you can see traces of red coming through here because it's more common in the 16th century to find that the chimney lintels and all the timbers of the room were painted with red ochre. And so grey becomes the dominant colour, the plain colour that was used in the 17th century. So this is original work which has been partly restored, but these are original pencil lines on here. And you find it also on the outside, not necessarily done so carefully. This example from Badley Hall shows that there are actually 3 schemes on here of a period of about 75 years. This was covered up with lathing and plaster, but the original brick nogging from about 1550 has been painted with white, and then it's been ruddled over. So you can see the original white line is here, there, and there. So they appear pink. And then when they ruddle it over, the second scheme was black penciling, which is here. And then that was ruddled over again. And then they put the final white lines on, which are the ones you can see here today. So that's very common, brick nogging buildings, and we'll see some examples in Debenham. You do not paint the timbers, you only paint the brick nogging. The other thing which I was interested in, so that's the paint side, was the people who lived in these buildings. Obviously, I'm describing to you what the interiors looked like to those people. So I was trying to trying to put the people back in the buildings rather than just dealing with the structures. But it was the objects that were found in the buildings and aspects of this which showed the unease of people in their daily lives and how they could try to make themselves feel more comfortable. People were bringing things forward that they'd found in their chimneys, under floors, but it was always very untrustworthy as to whether they were bringing everything together here or whether only some of the things being brought together. And so I set about trying to ask people to report things to me if they could, so that I could see them before they were actually unpacked out of the wall and the order which they put in. You get very large examples of these things I've called spiritual mittens, with 300 to 500 objects in them. This particular one is a late one from 1850 nearby, and it had 35 shoes in it. And over the years, June Swan, who you can see here was in charge of the museum in Northampton, was very helpful to me in dating the shoes and therefore to the strata of other material that was in these hoards. And so if I show you this one here, this was an early 18th century Ford, a find in 1983, just outside the town of Debenham. And the opponent person who was living in the house had been to a talk of mine. He called me in, and this is the first one we unpacked, where we saw the layers of objects and how they've been put in, and the range of dates of the shoes and things that were in them. And several of these have been found written these up under the term spiritual mittens now. So you can access those if you want to. Right, the other aspect of that unease was the use of symbols that were nothing to do with the marks that carpenters put on within the house for structural reasons. And this was found in 1972 when my wife Christine and I bought this house in Debenham, which was condemned. And she happened to be cleaning the beam and drew my attention to this. And you can see this, what I call a hexafoil here, has been bisected later by a spit rack. And I did a tracing of that, or I reinstated this bit, and that was in the exhibition with a number of these things. And we put them up in 1979, so that people could then begin to bring things forward to me. And that's how I started putting all these bits of evidence together. And I'll show you one more at the end of the talk today. So coming back to that aerial view we see of the town, you can see the broadest part of the street here is the marketplace. So we have a thing called a camping close here, which I'm going to explain in a minute. And because this is a period, 1621, when Puritan sentiments were obviously beginning to think that they shouldn't allow sporting activities, the tennis yard was closed, and so it's described as once the tennis yard. And the camping close, which was set up in 1470 here, which I'll explain again in a minute, is described as formerly the camping close. But this is the sporting ground for a game of camp ball. And it's a rough game of soccer, basically, sharp elbowed. But nearly all camping closes are close to the church, not necessarily owned by the church, but that's the common place to find them. And this particular camping close was divided in two. 1.5 acres of this was owned by this house down here, and the other acre was owned by this house here. Significant because both these big houses had inns next door, which they controlled, and they controlled the entrances into the camping close, which meant that they could sell drinks and food on the way in. So I'm going to start with one of the big inns here at the top of the street. This is the one that I think is called the Ram, but it had migrated next door in the 17th century in 1621 when this became a private house. But as this was built, it has a corridor along the back, which gets you into the suites of rooms here. You could take one room or two rooms. They were interconnecting as well. And at the far end here was a garderobe, which emptied down beside the chimney hearth, and you could get to the outside wall. We'll see another of those later on. The house became privatized in the early 17th century when this porch was put on, and it has its original cellar underneath here. But you can see the arrangement of the windows, one of which I've already shown you, were very evenly dispersed around the building. It's a very fine building. And that's what it looks like from the outside, brick knogged here. Not all brick nogging is necessarily identical, is original to the house. Sometimes it is, sometimes it's been put in 50 years later, but it's a status thing that is very, very common in Debenham. And the porch that I'm showing you is there. And if we go around the side, excuse me, you can see the corner post here, and it carries on around the side of the building. There's the view cut through with the balcony that takes you through down to the individual rooms and to the guard room. And then from the corner here, you can see the Market Cross. This is the building where the exhibition was held, which formerly was open on the ground floor with some sort of meeting room on the upper floor that became the schoolroom, and they also developed the attics at the same time. There was originally a three-part window here, but they decided to put a chimney in sitting on the first floorboards. Quite how that works, not sure. But the house, as I say, became into private hands. And so it was, several of the rooms were decorated. And we've already seen a bit of this one before. This particular one is showing two different schemes. You've got this underlying scheme of interlocking quatrefoils with flowers in them, which is somewhere around 1600. And with it goes moralizing texts here and text here on the top. And in the sometime in the early 17th century, they decided to abandon that scheme and cover it all with white paint to go for this green scheme, which is what I showed you earlier on, that these were usually the upper rooms were the ones which had the columns on them, and the lower rooms were painted with the just the plain colours on the timbers. And in fact, this particular room, the owner of this had it covered up because he didn't like it at all, and very kindly took it off for our exhibition 42 years ago, and we had hardboard on here. And so this was the first time it was seen for a long time. It had been seen sometime back in the 30s or 40s when it had been cleaned to show the two schemes together, because I don't think they were originally shown. But in particular, notice that there's an area there which is deliberately left unpainted. And that's where a pasted, almost certainly a pasted godly picture has been put on in that position. You've got enough text around that place. I think the reason for these, and I've seen them in a number of bed chambers, is that sleeping patterns in houses, or sleeping pattern, was always a worry to people at the time. And by having godly pictures, say of Christ or something up there, it aided sleep. And so you get these blank areas in a number of wall paintings like this. So that particular wall we just looked at is actually covering up a door belonging to the inn that led its way through from that balcony. So there you can see the blank area, and you can also notice down below here that there was a fixed bench under the window, and the painter has very carefully painted down here and round the side of the bench. There you are, you can see his line where the paintwork finishes. So this was in the exhibition. And you can see the form of the columns that are on here. A lot of these seem to be copied from churches, adapting from church columns. Opposite this building we just looked at is on the junction of Gracechurch Street is this building here, which is called Le Buck's Head. The Buck's Head again was closed later on and drifted into the next building. But we can see an 18th century house here, but the cellars are 16th century. And behind this building here is one I want to particularly show you in a minute, which is called the Buck's Head Standing. James Harrison owned this pub, and he owned what is described as the entry and the outlet, which takes you into his part of the camping close. So this is his house on the left-hand side. It doesn't look very big here, but I'll show it to you in a minute. And so around 1621, when that was closed, he had to make some changes to the arrangements here, and we'll come back to it in a little while. So that's his house. This is William Harrison's house. It's quite a big building, which Martin Bridges dated to 1417. And at the time, well, I'll come back to explain about the house in a minute, but I want to explain about the two people who own the camping close. They own the two biggest houses and the inn next door. So that's William Harrison. And if we go down the street, we have Nicolas Bell in 1621. He lives in this block here, this Wealdon house, which we'll come to at the very end. And he owns the Angel Inn, which is this one here, another Gallered Inn round the back. And lastly, we'll look at number one in High Street, and this is number 3. So I want to go back up to the Buck's Head. This is the building that I want to explain about because it's unique in England. It's a framed building as a standing for people to watch entertainments. When this drawing was done, it was done for a conference at the Globe Theatre, which I'll come to in a little while. But the dates on it are not relevant because it was since dendrodated, and we know that the back of it, the plain back of it here, is about 1608, 1609. And the decorative front here is 1621, which is the date when the camping close was closed. So Harrison owned this particular building, and I think he simply lifted it off the field and he's rebuilt the front of it for the inn yard, and he's placed it exactly on the line of his properties, his 2 properties. So it was subdivided in the middle. And so you've got these fancy turn columns, which we'll see in a little while. And the 3rd bay still was in existence in 1650. I've got a plan of it. But unfortunately, and that was the presumably the staircase came up there. It probably wasn't any longer, that was its size. But just to remind you that these sorts of buildings, which were put up onto things like the camping close, for watching the entertainments, camping closes not only have the game of camp ball, but they, in one case we know at Walsh and the Willows, they had a stage raised for the for actors to perform on in 1577, which is the date when the London theatres were getting going. And but it was already probably 100 years old, so playing in the round in Suffolk has a long history. And these buildings were never meant to be permanent. Like the great standing in Epping Forest of 1543, built for Henry VIII, they were covered with protected canvases in the wintertime and not painted, just covered in canvases. And then when the king was in residence, for instance, in that building, he'd bring his cloths were brought to hang around the standing, and he would put carpets over the front. So the whole thing, the colour of the building would be decorated by the textiles that were used in it. And almost certainly even in Debenham here, sort of fairly plain cloths would be used for exactly the same purpose as to be covered in winter. Probably had a permanent roof on it, but the actual frame itself. So it's remarkable this has survived because they are not really meant to last very long. But to show you how it works, I'm going to take this one in London. This was printed up in 1647. But in fact, it was probably drawn as early as 1627. I know quite a bit about this building, and you can see it's a restricted inn yard. I know about some of the actors who were here, and you can see a building which is 3 bays long with the stair in it. So it's pretty identical to the Debenham building. And what we've got is a fenestrel, I think, here sitting on the railings, which is to prevent the water coming in. And I guess this is probably canvas behind the timber frame there, which is again preventing the water coming in. So those can be taken off when people are watching whatever it is. And the lower part, as you can see, is just left open. We don't think there's anything in there at all. The reason for showing you both the Debenham building and this building, which you can see are very similar, is because of their relevance to the London theatres, which I've already hinted at. I was involved in coming up with a scheme. I've been asked to do a painter scheme for the Globe Theatre because Mark Rylance didn't like the idea that the theatre was very elaborately painted at the front and not all the way around. So he kind of, my brief was, it's all got to be painted or it's all got to be stripped. And I think actually, frankly, decorative cloths would have fulfilled the answer a lot with plaster ceilings over the timberwork, because this was, after all, a second-hand building. But that fell on undetermined ears already. Excuse me. And, you know, to give you an idea, here's a royal box for a jousting scene. And this is where all the standings came from. You can see the hangings here, decorative hangings, and the carpet for the people at the front, and even carpets as well, cushions to lean on as well. But of course, for the tilt yards, these would be in long lines. So you'd have standing after standing after standing, all subdivided up with cloth. And so standings were once a very common feature, but are now a great rarity. So just to finish up on the standing, Philip Aikens very kindly joined me for the conference there because it needed explaining about the structure of standings. All standings have bay posts without jowls on them, and they don't have braces, and that was something I was having to fight against down in London. And you can see why. I mean, okay, we know that all of this has been put in, these should be open, but you have a continuous row of windows without any interruption at all. And the railings are much further apart than the ones that are built at the Globe, which are based on George at Southwark. So, you know, this is what was expected, probably not for health and safety these days, but they are. And the house that Harrison owned next door, it was called the Timbers. I'm not sure what it's called now, but it's 21, 23 and 25 High Street anyway. But you can see that there's a crown post here in the middle. I think we could access the one in the parlour. At the time, I didn't know anything about this building, which is actually a contemporary building, which we'll have a look at in a minute. So if we go inside, you can see the reason why I couldn't get into that second wing. It's the smallest door I think I've ever been through. But in there, we were able to finally see the three crown posts. So this is the main one, which has been nicely boarded up in the attic space. And they've used, as you see, packing cases here to make the walling. But at least they didn't cut the crown post out, and they did preserve it in there. So that's the crown post that's been painted white at some point. And the packing cases around it were meant for Mr. S.G. of Debenham. Well, this was the house of Samuel Dove, who was our local historian in the early 19th century. Whether this is SG rather than SD for Samuel Dove, whether the phone line was bad that day when the order was given, I'm not quite sure. And then getting access into the other crown post, this is the one over the parlour, and then we have the one over that second wing. But it's the second wing is very interesting because you have a door here, 19th century door. And at the time when this was taken, I had already moved out of Debenham. This was 82 or 83. And so I wasn't aware that this work was going on. So I had to dash down and sort of photograph it at different stages. But what I was able to see was that this wall underneath here in this wing had totally modern timber in. There was no original timber. There were no mortises for timber. What you had here was a bracket and two stabilizing braces coming down on the sides here. So it was totally open to the street. So the door itself has got a pair of mortises above it, perhaps for a Pentis roof. I guess that this one here may be for matching bracket, but actually it's quite a fat bracket there. So I'm not sure whether that is the case, but there's one of those little corner brackets that belong to this corner. So that's a building that I have never seen before. Interested to know if any of you have. The upper part of the building too showed that you had this big double jowl here to take the valley on the top, and there were enough bits of traced window around there to show quite a decorative front to the building. Inside, the room is very handsome. This is the parlour, very tall and lofty with a late 17th, early 18th century ceiling. But it must have always been a tall room, even in the medieval period. And as I say, this was a building that was dated by Martin at 1417. And the fireplace in that room has been made smaller in the 17th century. This is probably a 16th century chimney lintel here with early 17th century decoration on it. And then underneath here, you have imitation ashlar, which is white mortar with black pencil lines in it. Something we see, obviously, you recognize it from early churches and cathedrals, usually done with red lines, mortar blocks like this. But this is nicely remodeled, but showing different stages of decoration on it. And I'm going to take you behind the blue door here in just a minute, but to explain that Martin also dated this building here, which is one of the few 17th century buildings in the town, tripartite windows again, which is dated 1601 to 1611. Broadway house. Anyway, if you go in the garden house there, I'm showing really with this paint theory going through the afternoon. This rather nice corner cupboard here with a picture of Bacchus whisking Ariadne away in his chariot to dump her off at Naxos, rather unceremoniously with his and taking off with his cheaters. So that's that house done, and this is going back up the street again. I'm not going beyond the church, which is where John Walker went this morning, but I wanted to show you this building because it resembles one we're going to see at the end of the day. You see there's a rope pattern on the front, what we've already described, Philip has already described with his up bracing, cranked up bracing here. And but if you look underneath, you can see that the paint is coloured red under here. So that was quite, I'm sure that was quite common at one stage, because people love to think it's got to be black. But there we are, that's a detail to remember, because the plaster strips and the rope decoration is very similar to one we're going to look at a bit later. And this has been dated 1526. But inside the parlour of this house, I knew that the man was William and Mary Motts were living there, but I put my head into the room one day when a couple of people that I got to know quite well later on were just beginning to restore it. And on this wall here, I could see traces of wall painting. So I told them to be careful. Well, that's what they found on the other wall. So pretty spectacular monochrome painting. And you can see it's for William and Mary Motts. Rather interesting, they've used their surname. If you look very carefully, you can see it's the Marian form of M with the A and the R on it. Whether they had any Catholic leanings, I don't know. But there we are, that's the building there. And going to the top of the churchyard, looking back down into the marketplace, where the red telephone box is here is where the Guildhall is. This is the Red Lion, which is was the Lion, and then before that was the Garling House. And there was another corner post here, so lots of corner posts around, and a corner post here I'll show you in a minute. And then further down where the shambles are, we had traditionally had the toll house here through the medieval period. And in this building here, I discovered two stalls. One was 16th, one was 17th century, two-story market stalls, which have been incorporated in this building, and a third one, which is only a single-story height stall, which I've only got two fragments of, but enough possibly to reconstruct it. So they don't survive very often too, but they are, that's where they are. And this is where the river comes down. This is the start of the River Deben. The Guildhall has a polite sort of 18th century facade to it now. But when you go inside, this is what you see. And so you've got a 4-bay hall with an outer door here, which is the access point, which was then blocked by the 16th century building. So as soon as the connection was lost, as soon as the building ceased to be a Guildhall, this was constructed, which blocked that door off. The building was taken over by 3 people I got to know quite well, one of whom was Angus McBain, the photographer. And they opened up at least these 2 bays here, show a very spacious room with queen post and crown post arrangement at the top here. And then beyond it, if you go beyond, you see that it was subdivided like this before with attics. And as you go up to those attics, you pass the blocked door that originally came into that building. And so that's where we saw it earlier on and what it looked like. But we know that after this ceased to be a Guildhall and a brew house, it carried on being an inn. But there was a man who was living here who was Harrison. It was another Harrison, I think William Harrison. And I think we'll see him again in a minute. He had in his will some sort of cloth making, cutting devices. So perhaps he was also dyeing cloth. It's not in the cloth making tradition in this part of the world, but he's both making his drink here and for his cloth. The upper room here, which I think perhaps was used by the priest, goes straight into this open-sided porch. So there was no walling between the two. And when Mike and I were up in the roof, we found all the bits of roof crown posts and things that, oh, it's actually a king post here in this roof with a ridge piece, that made the porch extend out into the street. So I think this may have been an oratory attached to a priest room. But the upper room on the corner now has a very fine 17th century plaster ceiling with the initials of George and Elizabeth Harrison, who were here in 1621. And there you are, George left my shearman shears in his will. So possibly that's what he was doing, dyeing cloth. And the back of the brew house has a series of open windows, very closely spaced together and with uprising shutters. And I'm sorry, my thing keeps popping out. There's the external door that gets you up onto the gallery floor. And then there's an internal door for the ill brethren to get up there to view the flats below. And this is the open truss into the porch, as I mentioned before. That's the corner post. And in Dove's books, he wrote 2 books towards the history of Debenham, and he got various people to draw up parts of the building. And fortunately, this part of the crown post, corner post survives, as does one of these. You can still see to the left, just here. So across the road, we have this other building, which is number 3. Which is the second building we saw for the owner of the camping close. I want to briefly take you inside. We have a porch there, which is early 16th century, and the rear addition is early 16th century. The main hall here has a solar and service and a shop. The walls at this end are explained by the fact they're both running with the river rather than anything else. And this demolished section, which we thought was a demolished section, I'm grateful for Philip Aikens recently telling me that the open truss is probably because it was up against a building that was owned by this person. And in fact, Philip suggests quite rightly this early 15th century house was probably always an inn in the right place. But the angel next door has a gallery going around the back, and one of the most extravagant marked beams I've seen, which you can see here. So the house itself has a cross-quadrate crown post and a long Stotts Place scarf, which is visible on the front flying beam at the front here, the Wealden house. And so this is the open hall, service rooms. And then inside, you can go inside through the 1530 doorway and see the original door of the house. And then looking from the other end, going back to the street, you see there's a pair of doors here going into the service and the shop next door. And the staircase is, we don't have a separate door for the staircase here, because I think if this was the way into the inn, it was more secure to sort of lock the door and you have to get upstairs by going through into the other part of the house. And so the old hall was upgraded in 1530 with this ceiling and fireplace. Further hearth was added to the hall chamber above. It has an original window there, and this is one of the painted fireplaces we looked at earlier. Very fine detail on the chimney lintels themselves, and then you can see, yeah, that's to do with the mouldings on the corners. But behind this wall here is one of the guardrobes, and there it is, and that then disappeared downstairs. And you can pick it up from the outside wall, because when you look at here, you've got a pilaster strip here and only 2 others which are very closely spaced together. And when you look carefully, you can see that this has been filled in later on. There you are. It's been boarded in. And in fact, there's a drawing done only 10 years before I arrived in Debenham showing the door was still in place then, where you could empty that out. And there's the very fine window in that corner. At the back of the main new hall, are clerestory windows which are south facing, but unfortunately they've been built against, so they aren't open now. One of the 2 original internal doors here, which is worth having a quick look at, because you can see that the hinges on it match the hinges on the porch chamber upstairs. So these are 1530 doors with nice ironwork on them. And then when you go upstairs, you see that the porch door is actually double leafed, so that it's a great strong door with a massive lock on it. So it's presumably used as a muniment room. And then finally, we come to this building on the corner. This is the corner post, which is brought forward around about 1900 when they put the new shop front on. Of course, around about 1950s, an antique made an offer that they couldn't refuse, and it fell apart when he took it out, and so did all the locals. Under the floor upstairs, this is the last thing I'm going to show you, is a shutterboard. This is a window shutterboard with 18th century hinges on. And just to continue my little theme of paintwork that was going through the town here, which has always been part of my interest, you can see that it has the name of Girling Plummer Glazier house painter on it. And in fact, I had already spotted a book in the safe of the church, which had William Girling from Framlingham admitted to this parish in 1783, I think it was. So that's it. Okay. And if you want to follow up on any of the articles, you can get them through the academia website with my name on it.